When we begin to understand the psychology of a narcissistic individual, one of the first things we must recognize is that what appears as confidence is often a carefully maintained illusion of control. This control is not just about dominating others in obvious ways. It is far more subtle and deeply rooted. It's about shaping how they are perceived, managing emotional environments, and ensuring that interactions unfold in ways that protect their fragile inner world. The narcissist does not simply want influence, they require it to sustain their sense of self. But here's where something fundamental begins to shift. The illusion of control, no matter how sophisticated, is still an illusion. It depends on compliance, on predictability, on others playing their assigned roles, whether that role is the admirer, the rescuer, or even the one who absorbs blame. And when that dynamic changes, even slightly, the structure begins to destabilize. You might notice this in very subtle ways at first. The person they once manipulated no longer reacts with the same emotional intensity. The arguments that used to spiral into confusion now fall flat. The silence that once gave the narcissist power now becomes a boundary they cannot penetrate. In these moments, something deeply unsettling happens for them. The script they've relied on stops working. From a psychological perspective, this is not just frustrating, it is disorienting, because the narcissist's sense of identity is externally regulated, meaning it relies heavily on feedback from others. Any disruption in that feedback creates a kind of internal void. It's not simply that they are losing control of a situation. It's that they are losing the mechanism through which they stabilize themselves. And so, confusion sets in. Not the kind of confusion we might experience when we're uncertain about a decision, but a deeper, almost existential confusion. Why isn't this working anymore? Becomes the unspoken question. But rather than turning inward with curiosity, as a psychologically integrated person might, the narcissist often doubles down on the very behaviors that are failing them. This is where we see the first cracks in the illusion. Control, when it is authentic, is flexible. It adapts. It allows for mutual influence and respects boundaries. But control, when it is rooted in insecurity and fear, is rigid. It cannot tolerate change. And so, when reality no longer aligns with the narcissist's expectations, they don't adjust to reality. They attempt to force reality back into alignment. You may see this as increased manipulation, more intense emotional reactions, or even a sudden shift in tactics. What once worked subtly now becomes overt. What was once masked by charm may now reveal itself as coercion. And paradoxically, the harder they try to regain control, the more obvious their lack of control becomes. There's an important philosophical dimension here as well. The narcissist's struggle is, in many ways, a struggle against reality itself, because reality includes other people's autonomy, their right to think, feel, and choose independently. And when someone builds their identity around controlling others, they are, in essence, denying this fundamental truth. So when the illusion begins to crack, it is not just a personal failure, it is a confrontation with the reality they have long avoided. And this confrontation is deeply threatening, not because it exposes them as weak in a superficial sense, but because it brings them closer to feelings they have spent a lifetime defending against: shame, inadequacy, and a profound sense of disconnection from their authentic self. These are not easy experiences to face. In fact, for many narcissistic individuals, they are almost intolerable. So instead of integration, we often see escalation. Instead of reflection, we see reaction. The illusion must be preserved at all costs, even as it visibly crumbles. And this is the paradox. The very moment that offers the possibility for growth becomes the moment where the narcissist resists growth most intensely. For those on the receiving end, this shift can feel both confusing and clarifying. Confusing because the behavior may intensify in unexpected ways. Clarifying because the mask begins to slip, revealing patterns that were previously hidden beneath layers of charm or subtle manipulation. And in that clarity, there is an opportunity, not to change the narcissist, but to step out of the illusion altogether. Because ultimately, the illusion of control only exists as long as it is reinforced. Once it is no longer fed, once it is no longer believed in or responded to, it begins to dissolve. And what remains is not power, but the absence of it. Once that initial illusion of control begins to crack, something even more revealing starts to unfold. The very strategies the narcissist once relied on so heavily, their carefully honed tools of manipulation begin to turn inward, almost as if the system they built can no longer distinguish between controlling others and ensnaring itself. This is where we see a kind of psychological inversion take place, where the tactics that once gave them power become the very mechanisms of their loss of control. Consider, for a moment, the function of manipulation in the narcissistic dynamic. It is not random. It is often precise, repeated, and reinforced over time. Gaslighting, for instance, is used to destabilize another person's sense of reality, to create doubt, to weaken their confidence in their own perceptions. But what happens when that person, through awareness or exhaustion, stops questioning themselves? What happens when they no longer engage in that destabilizing dance? The narcissist is then faced with a mirror they did not anticipate. The confusion they once induced in others begins to echo back toward them. Their words no longer carry the same weight. Their attempts to rewrite reality are met not with emotional reactivity, but with clarity or even silence. And in that moment, something deeply unsettling occurs. The manipulation loses its function. From a psychological standpoint, this is not just a failed tactic. It is a collapse of a relational pattern that the narcissist has come to depend on. Because these behaviors are not simply strategies, they are adaptive responses formed, often unconsciously, in earlier stages of life. They were ways of maintaining safety, of preserving a sense of self in environments where authenticity may not have been welcomed or supported. And so, when these adaptations stop working, the narcissist is left without a familiar way to navigate the world. What we often see then is repetition, but with increasing intensity. The narcissist does not easily abandon their tools, even when those tools are no longer effective. In fact, they may use them more aggressively. The gaslighting becomes more obvious. The blame shifting becomes more desperate. The emotional withdrawal becomes more pronounced. But instead of regaining control, these escalations expose the pattern even further. There is a certain irony here, and it is not a superficial one. The narcissist, in attempting to maintain control, reveals the very lack of control they are trying to conceal. Their behaviors become predictable in their unpredictability. What once operated beneath the surface now becomes visible, almost transparent, to those who are no longer emotionally entangled in the dynamic. And this is where the concept of a trap becomes particularly meaningful, because the narcissist is not simply trapped by external circumstances. They are trapped within their own psychological framework, a framework that resists flexibility, that cannot easily accommodate mutuality, that depends on a one-sided flow of influence. When that flow is disrupted, the system does not reorganize. It begins to break down. Philosophically, we might say that this reflects a deeper tension between control and reality. Reality, by its very nature, is dynamic. It involves other people with their own agency, their own perspectives, their own boundaries. Control, in the narcissistic sense, attempts to override this dynamism, to impose a fixed narrative on something that is inherently fluid. And so, when reality asserts itself, as it inevitably does, the imposed structure cannot hold. Now, for those who have been on the receiving end of these dynamics, this phase can be both revealing and disorienting. You may begin to see the patterns more clearly, perhaps for the first time without the fog of self-doubt. But you may also notice an escalation in behavior that feels disproportionate, even alarming. It's important to understand that this escalation is not a sign of regained power. It is a sign of its erosion. Because true power does not need to coerce. It does not need to distort. It does not rely on confusion to sustain itself. What you are witnessing in these moments is not strength, but the unraveling of a system that was never stable to begin with. And as this unraveling continues, something else becomes possible. Distance, emotional, psychological, sometimes physical, begins to form, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of clarity. You begin to recognize that you are no longer participating in the same reality, that the rules that once governed the interaction no longer apply in the same way. This is not about eating the narcissist in a conventional sense. It is about stepping sharage, the structure that gave those tactics their power. Because manipulation only works when it is engaged with, when it is believed, when it is responded to on its own terms. Once that engagement ceases, the tactic has nowhere to land. And so, the trap closes, not around you, but around the pattern itself. The narcissist, unable to adapt, continues to use the same tools, unaware that those tools have lost their effectiveness. And in doing so, they reinforce the very outcome they are trying to avoid. What we come to see, then, is a kind of inevitability, not in a deterministic sense, but in a psychological one. When a system is built on distortion, it cannot sustain itself indefinitely in the presence of clarity. When a strategy depends on another person's confusion, it collapses in the presence of awareness. And perhaps the most important takeaway here is this: when their tactics begin to fail, it is not your responsibility to make them work again. Your role is not to re-enter the confusion, to restore the pattern, or to soften the truth so it becomes tolerable for them. As this dynamic continues to unravel, we arrive at a point that is perhaps even more destabilizing for the narcissist than the failure of their tactics, the loss of what we might call emotional supply. Now, this term is often used casually, but it points to something quite profound. For the narcissist, emotional responses from others are not merely interactions, they are a form of psychological sustenance. They regulate a fragile internal state that cannot easily maintain itself. Validation, admiration, attention, even conflict serve a function. They provide feedback that reassures the narcissist of their existence, their importance, their place in the world. Without this feedback, there is not just discomfort, but a kind of internal disorganization. It's as though the external mirrors they rely on have suddenly been removed, and they are left without a clear sense of who they are. So when the person they once influenced begins to withdraw that emotional engagement, when reactions become neutral, minimal, or absent, the impact is not insignificant. It is deeply unsettling. The silence, the lack of reactivity, the refusal to participate in emotional escalation, these are experienced not as indifference, but as a kind of psychological deprivation. And here we begin to see instability emerge more visibly, because without that steady flow of emotional input, the narcissist is forced, however briefly, into contact with their internal world. And this is a space they have often spent a lifetime avoiding. Not because they are unwilling, in a conscious sense, but because that internal space may hold unresolved pain, early wounds, feelings of inadequacy or rejection that were never fully processed. From a developmental perspective, this makes sense. Many narcissistic patterns are rooted in environments where emotional needs were either unmet, inconsistently met, or tied to performance and image. The child learns, in such contexts, that their authentic self is not enough, that they must construct a version of themselves that can secure attention or approval. Over time, this constructed self becomes dominant, while the authentic self remains underdeveloped or hidden. Emotional supply, then, becomes a way of maintaining that constructed self. It keeps the deeper vulnerabilities at bay. But when that supply is disrupted, the barrier begins to thin, and what lies beneath is not easily integrated, especially without the tools or awareness to process it. So what we often observe is not reflection, but reaction. The narcissist may become more demanding, more reactive, more insistent on eliciting a response. There may be attempts to provoke through criticism, through withdrawal, through unpredictability, not necessarily because they want conflict, but because even negative attention is preferable to no attention at all. It confirms that they still have an impact, that they still exist in the emotional landscape of the other person. But when even these attempts fail, when the other person maintains their boundaries, their clarity, their emotional independence, the instability deepens. You may see fluctuations in behavior that seem contradictory, moments of anger followed by attempts at charm, periods of silence followed by sudden re-engagement. It can feel confusing, even chaotic, but it reflects an internal state that is struggling to find equilibrium. There is something important to understand here, especially for those who have been conditioned to respond The instability you are witnessing is not something you are responsible for regulating. In fact, the more you step in to stabilize it by offering reassurance, by engaging in the emotional back and forth, the more you reinforce the very dependency that sustains the pattern. This is not about withdrawal as punishment. It is about the natural consequence of no longer participating in a dynamic that requires your emotional energy to function. And in that withdrawal, something significant occurs. The narcissist is left without their usual means of regulation. And while this may lead to escalation in the short term, it also exposes the limitations of the structure they have relied on. Philosophically, we might say that this is a moment of potential transformation, though not one that is easily embraced. Because to truly adapt, the narcissist would need to turn inward, to develop an internal source of stability, to confront aspects of themselves that have long been avoided. This is difficult work. It requires vulnerability, a coup, not-ability, and a willingness to experience discomfort without immediately escaping it. And so, more often than not, we see resistance rather than transformation. The search for new sources of supply may begin. Old patterns may be repeated in new contexts, but the underlying instability remains because it is not being addressed at its root. For you, however, the shift is equally significant. As you disengage from providing that emotional supply, you begin to reclaim something that may have been gradually eroded: your own sense of self, your own emotional autonomy. You are no longer defined by how you are perceived or how effectively you can manage another person's state. You begin to exist outside of that system. And this is where the power dynamic truly begins to change. Not through confrontation, not through dominance, but through absence, through the quiet, consistent refusal to participate in what no longer aligns with your well-being. Because when emotional supply is no longer available, the illusion of control cannot be sustained. And what is revealed is not just the instability of the narcissist, but the strength of your own detachment. As this process unfolds further, we begin to encounter a moment that is in many ways inevitable. Once awareness enters the dynamic, the exposure of the false persona. Up until this point, much of the narcissist's power has depended on presentation, the image they project, confident, composed, often even admirable, serves as a kind of protective layer. It shapes how others interpret their behavior, and just as importantly, how they interpret themselves. But a persona, no matter how convincing, is still a construction. It requires maintenance. It depends on consistency, on narrative control, on the ability to influence how events are perceived. And when the underlying patterns begin to be recognized, when the manipulation is named, when the inconsistencies are noticed, when the emotional dynamics are no longer taken at face value, that construction starts to lose its integrity. Exposure does not always happen dramatically. In fact, it is often quiet. It occurs in moments of realization, in the gradual piecing together of experiences that once felt confusing. Someone begins to see the pattern, not just the isolated incidents. They begin to trust their own perception again, and in doing so, they no longer rely on the narcissist version of reality to make sense of what is happening. This shift is profound, because once a person is no longer operating faithful of the narrative that the narcissist has created, the persona loses its function. The charm no longer feels authentic. The confidence begins to appear rehearsed. Even the moments of vulnerability, which may once have elicited empathy, are now seen in a different light, perhaps as strategic, perhaps as inconsistent. And this is where something destabilizing occurs for the narcissist. The persona is not just a social tool. It is intertwined with their sense of identity. To have it questioned or seen through is not simply uncomfortable. It is experienced as a kind of psychological threat, because what lies beneath that persona is not a fully integrated self, but often a fragmented one, shaped by earlier experiences that were never fully processed or understood. So when exposure happens, the response is rarely one of acknowledgement. More often, it is defensiveness. There may be attempts to discredit the person who is seeing clearly. There may be a reassertion of the original narrative, sometimes with greater intensity, or there may be a shift in strategy altogether, moving from charm to intimidation, from persuasion to dismissal. What we are witnessing in these moments is not confidence being challenged, but insecurity being revealed. And it is important to understand that this insecurity is not superficial. It is deeply rooted, often tied to early experiences of not being seen, not being valued, or being valued, or being valued only conditionally. The persona developed as a way of compensating for that, of creating a version of self that could be accepted or even admired. But the cost of that adaptation is authenticity. The individual becomes identified with the image rather than the self, and so when the image is threatened, there is very little internal structure to fall back on. This is why the reactions can seem disproportionate. What may appear, from the outside, as a minor challenge to their behavior is experienced, internally, as a much larger destabilization. For those who have been in relationship with this dynamic, exposure can bring a mix of clarity and grief. Clarity, because things begin to make sense in a way they did not before. The confusion lifts. The patterns become visible. But there is also grief, because what is being seen more clearly is not just the behavior, but the absence of something that may have been hoped for. Genuine connection, mutual understanding, emotional reciprocity. And this is not an easy realization to sit with, because it often requires letting go of the idea that the persona was real in the way it appeared. It asks you to accept that what was presented consistently may not have been grounded in the same reality you were operating in. But within that acceptance, there is also a kind of liberation, because once the persona is seen for what it is, a construction, a protective mechanism, it no longer holds the same authority. It no longer defines the interaction. You are no longer relating to the image, but recognizing the pattern behind it. And this recognition changes everything. It alters how you respond, how you interpret, how you engage, or choose not to engage. The dynamic loses its ambiguity, and with that, it loses much of its power. From a broader perspective, this moment of exposure highlights a fundamental truth about human relationships: that authenticity cannot be replaced indefinitely by performance. Sooner or later, the gap between the two becomes visible, and when it does, the relationship must either move toward greater honesty or begin to dissolve. In the case of narcissistic dynamics, that movement toward honesty is often resisted, not because it is impossible, but because it requires confronting aspects of the self that have long been avoided. And without that willingness, the persona remains the primary mode of engagement, even as it becomes less and less effective. So what we see, ultimately, is a kind of unraveling, not just of behavior, but of identity as it has been constructed. And while this may appear, on the surface, as a loss of control, it is more accurately understood as a loss of illusion. As the illusion continues to collapse and the persona becomes increasingly difficult to sustain, we arrive at a phase that is often the most visible and, in many ways, the most misunderstood: the emergence of rage, panic, and a kind of emotional desperation. From the outside, it can appear sudden, even disproportionate, as though something minor has triggered an extreme reaction. But when we look more closely, we begin to see that what is being expressed is not just anger in the ordinary sense. It is a response to a deeper psychological threat. Up until this point, the narcissist has relied on a system that, while unstable, has been functional: control, manipulation, emotional supply, and the maintenance of a persona. All of these elements have worked together to keep their internal world regulated. But as these elements begin to fail simultaneously, the individual is left without the usual mechanisms that have allowed them to maintain an equilibrium. And this is where panic begins to emerge, not always in a way that is consciously recognized, but in the sense of urgency, of escalating attempts to regain control. There is a feeling, often unspoken, that something is slipping beyond their grasp. And because the narcissistic structure does not easily allow for vulnerability or self-reflection, that panic is not processed inwardly, it is projected outwardly. Rage, in this context, becomes a kind of defensive expression. It is not simply about anger toward another person. It is about protecting the self from a perceived collapse. The other person, especially the one who has begun to disengage or see clearly, becomes the focal point of that rage. They are blamed, criticized, sometimes even devalued in ways that seem abrupt or contradictory to previous behavior. This is what is often referred to as narcissistic rage, but the term can be misleading if we interpret it too narrowly. It is not just an emotional outburst. It is a reaction to a loss of psychological control. And beneath that reaction is something much more vulnerable, an encounter with feelings that have long been defended against, feelings of inadequacy, of rejection, of not being enough in the absence of external validation. But rather than allowing those feelings to surface and be processed, the narcissist attempts to override them. The rage serves to reassert dominance, to push the discomfort outward, to regain a sense of power through intensity. There may be attempts to intimidate, to provoke, to draw the other person back into an emotional exchange where control can be reestablished. And when rage alone does not achieve that, we may see a shift into other forms of desperation, sudden attempts at reconciliation, exaggerated expressions of affection, promises of change. These can emerge not necessarily from a place of genuine transformio, but from a need to restore the previous dynamic. It is not uncommon to see a rapid oscillation between hostility and apparent vulnerability, creating a kind of emotional unpredictability that can be difficult to navigate. For the person on the receiving end, this phase can be particularly challenging. There is often a pull to respond, to defend, to explain, to de-escalate. And this is understandable, especially if there has been a long history of trying to maintain harmony or avoid conflict. But it is important to recognize that these reactions, however well-intentioned, can inadvertently re-engage the very dynamic that is in the process of dissolving. Because what the narcissist is seeking in these moments is not resolution in the traditional sense. It is re-entry into a system where their emotional expressions, once again, generate the responses they rely on. Whether those responses are fear, guilt, confusion, or even reassurance, they serve to re-establish a connection that feels like control. But when that response is no longer provided, when there is a consistent boundary, a refusal to engage on those terms, the intensity begins to lose its effectiveness. The rage, the panic, the desperation, they no longer produce the desired outcome, and this can lead to further escalation in the short term, but over time, it reveals the limitations of the strategy. There is a deeper philosophical insight here as well. When a person cannot tolerate the loss of control, they become increasingly controlled by their need to control. Their reactions are no longer choices. They are compulsions, driven by an internal state that they cannot regulate in more adaptive ways. And so, what appears as power from the outside is, in fact, a form of bondage. For you, however, something different is taking place. As you maintain your boundaries, as you resist the pull to re-enter the emotional turbulence, you begin to experience a different kind of stability. Not one that is dependent on managing another person's reactions, but one that comes from alignment with your own perception, your own limits, your own sense of what is acceptable. This does not mean the situation becomes easy. There may still be moments of doubt, moments where the intensity of the other person's reaction creates pressure to respond. But with awareness, you begin to see those moments not as crises, but as part of a pattern that is playing itself out. And in that recognition, there is a kind of quiet strength. You are no longer reacting to the surface expression. You are understanding the underlying dynamic. And that understanding allows you to remain grounded, even when the other person is not. So what we are witnessing in this phase is not just emotional volatility, but the exposure of a system that cannot sustain itself without control. And as that system becomes more visible, it also becomes less compelling. Finally, we arrive at the culmination of this process, the moment where the dynamic fully shifts and the consequences of the narcissist's own strategies become undeniable. This is the phase I call the final collapse, the point at which what once provided them power now exposes their deepest vulnerabilities. All the tactics, all the manipulation, all the carefully maintained facades reach a limit, and in that limit the reversal becomes clear. The person they sought to dominate is no longer subject to their control, and the narcissist is left facing the consequences of their own actions. It is important to understand that this collapse is not necessarily sudden. It may unfold over months, even years, through a series of subtle shifts in perception and behavior. What once seemed stable, the control, the influence, the emotional supply slowly dissipates. Boundaries that were previously ignored are now respected. Reactions that were once automatic are no longer given, and the narrative that once sustained the narcissist's sense of identity begins to fail. At this stage, the narcissist is confronted with something profoundly destabilizing: reality, in its unvarnished form. Until this point, reality has been filtered, manipulated, and interpreted in ways that maintain the illusion of control. But when those filters no longer function, when the other person is no longer participating in the dynamic, reality asserts itself in its full, undeniable presence, and the narcissist cannot impose their narrative on it. This is more than a loss of control. It is a confrontation with consequence. Every act of manipulation, every breach of trust, every attempt to shape another person's behavior now returns to the narcissist in some form. The strategies that once reinforced their sense of superiority and stability now highlight their fragility. And because these individuals are rarely equipped with the internal resources for self-reflection, the confrontation with their own limitations can be experienced as panic, shame, or even despair. We see, in these moments, the full inversion of the power dynamic. What was once their source of authority, their ability to influence, intimidate, charm, or provoke, now serves as evidence of weakness. Every attempt to regain dominance becomes more transparent, more desperate, more ineffective, and yet paradoxically, it is in this very struggle that the narcissist often continues to escalate behavior, as if doubling down could somehow restore what has already been lost. Philosophically, this phase illustrates a fundamental truth about relational dynamics. Power built on manipulation and control is inherently unstable. When one person's sense of self is entwined with the subjugation or emotional regulation of another, it creates a fragile equilibrium. The moment the other person disengages, asserts autonomy, or reclaims their perception, the equilibrium cannot hold. The system collapses under its own contradictions. For those who have been on the receiving end, this collapse can bring a profound sense of liberation. The tension, the unpredictability, the constant emotional labor required to maintain the dynamic, these pressures begin to lift. There is clarity where once there was confusion. There is space for reflection where once there was obligation. The reversal is not about revenge or superiority. It is about the restoration of boundaries and the reclaiming of personal agency. Yet, even as freedom emerges, the narcissist's collapse serves as a mirror. It reflects the consequences of prolonged avoidance of self-awareness, of reliance on external validation rather than internal stability, and of the profound costs of a life built around the control of others. There is a deep lesson here, not only about the dangers of narcissism, but about the importance of cultivating a sense of self that is resilient, self-reflective, and capable of holding discomfort without projection. And this brings us to a vital insight. The reversal of power is both inevitable and instructive. Inevitably, because a relational system cannot sustain itself on distortion and unilateral control indefinitely. Instructively, because it provides a living demonstration of the limitations of coercion and manipulation. What is revealed is not merely the narcissist's failure, but the strength and clarity of the person who no longer participates in the dynamic. Ultimately, this final collapse is not about destruction. It is about clarity. It is the moment when illusions dissolve, patterns are revealed, and consequences are acknowledged. And for those who have maintained boundaries, cultivated awareness, and disengaged from the manipulative system, it is also the moment of empowerment, a quiet yet profound affirmation that the cycle of control has been broken. And so, we reach a central truth that threads through every stage of this process. Control that is rooted in fear, insecurity, and manipulation cannot endure. The moment you step out of the dynamic and reclaim your autonomy, the narcissist loses the very leverage they thought they had. What once gave them power now exposes their vulnerabilities. And in that exposure, there is not only collapse, but also the possibility of insight for them, if they are capable of it, and for you, an unshakable confirmation of your own freedom. As we step back and look at the entire journey we've traced, from the first cracks in the illusion of control to the failure of manipulation, the withdrawal of emotional supply, the exposure of the false persona, the eruption of rage and panic, and finally, the ultimate collapse, we begin to see a pattern that is both profound and instructive. What emerges is not merely a story about a narcissist losing control, but a reflection of the deeper truths of human relationships, identity, and freedom. Throughout this process, it becomes clear that the power a narcissist wields is never true power. It is a borrowed power, dependent entirely on the compliance, emotional reactions, and perceptions of others. When those responses are withdrawn, when boundaries are maintained, and when clarity replaces confusion, that power dissolves. And in its place, something far more meaningful arises: the opportunity for autonomy, self-respect, and insight. The narcissist collapse is not just their own failure. It is a mirror showing what is unsustainable when a life is built on control, fear, and avoidance of authentic selfhood. And it is a reminder of the resilience of those who refuse to participate in the manipulation, who reclaim their perception, and who refuse to let another person define their reality. At its core, this entire dynamic teaches us about the nature of true power. True power is not coercion. It is not intimidation. It does not rely on confusion or emotional leverage. True power is grounded in presence, clarity, and the integrity of one's own mind and heart. When you operate from that space, no external manipulation can undermine you. When you step out of the cycle, the game is reversed, not through confrontation, not through retaliation, but simply through the reclamation of your own autonomy. So the conclusion of this journey is both simple and profound. Control built on manipulation is inherently unstable, and freedom is found not in defeating others, but in refusing to be defined by them. When the narcissist's game turns against them, what is revealed is their fragility, and what is affirmed is your strength. And in that truth, we find clarity, liberation, and the unshakable affirmation that no one can take from you what you refuse to surrender. The final message, then, is this: your power has always been within you. Their collapse only confirms it, and stepping into that freedom is not an act of revenge. It is the natural, inevitable consequence of choosing yourself over the illusion they created.